Hi there, I'm Andrew Agabak, a 25-year veteran of management consulting at the Boston Consulting Group, and here's one thing I wish I'd known when I first started out, and that's how to deal with impossible requests. And I don't just mean difficult. I've been asked plenty of difficult things before I joined management consulting, but I mean literally impossible. That happens a little bit more often than you might expect. I certainly had multiple occasions where the project lead asked me to do some analysis to solve a particular client problem, and I find out that the data we needed, for example, was unavailable. It literally didn't exist, or perhaps it would be illegal or unethical for us to have access to it. So what do you do? Well, there's three things, first of all, you shouldn't do. One is just give up. That's probably not very, very helpful. Second is fake the data or fake the analysis. That's not right either. And the third thing is toil through the night, desperately banging your head against a brick wall, trying to achieve something that is patently impossible. So what can you do if the data, for example, is literally unavailable? Well, I think the first thing to do is to try and understand the real objective of what problem you're trying to solve for your client, and the real vision behind what the project lead has asked to do in structuring the work. And sometimes you'll find, when you think carefully about that analysis, that there's another way of approaching the problem that might be able to get to the same answer, or at least part of the answer, in a way that's actually helpful. So for example, perhaps you've been asked to do some market sizing. Let's pick something random, for Alpen breakfast cereal in Spain. And you've been wanted to do a top-down analysis based on market share of the key players of muesli in Spain, and you find that data is just not available. Well, what could you do? Well, you could perhaps do some bottom-up analysis and say, okay, well, how many people consume cereal at all in Spain, and think about the need for from a population bottom-up perspective as opposed from a brand market share perspective top-down. So anyway, you explore different ways of accessing the problem, and then you go back to the project lead and say, turns out what you asked for was literally impossible for the following reasons. Here's what I've done to try and find access to data. Here's why it's not available. Here are my thoughts on what we could do instead that might get to some of the answer or most of the answer. Here's what I think we'd get. Here's what I think we wouldn't get. And you may find that the project lead has got some other ideas himself or herself about other ways of getting hold of the data you haven't thought of, or different ways of approaching the problem. But you brainstorm together and you come up with an agreed approach, and then you go off. And then you go ahead and do your analysis, you come up with some answers, and maybe it solves the problem. Hey, congratulations, well done. Often you'll find it gets you part of the way there, but not getting you the answer that you want. So what else can you do then? Well, you may not be able to get to an exact answer, but you might be able to put a roof or a ceiling or a floor on a range of what the data could be. So perhaps, for example, you can't get the data for Alpen, but you can get the data for all breakfast cereal, and you can say, well, we don't think Alpen would ever be more than X% of the sales of breakfast cereal. That sets an upper ceiling. We don't think it'd ever be less than Y, and so that sets a floor. Okay, so you might be able to have a range. Maybe you can get a friend to go to some supermarkets in Spain and say, what percentage of the shelf space in the cereal aisle are devoted to Alpen and muesli? And that may be able, especially if you go to multiple brands of supermarket, multiple parts of Spain, get you multiple different data points that allows you to gradually triangulate a level of confidence on a minimum and maximum range that you would be happy putting in front of the client. And if that's still not good enough, another way of approaching the problem is sometimes to reverse engineer it by saying, what would you have to believe? So for example, you're trying to put together a business case of whether it would make sense to launch this Alpen or muesli product in Spain, and you say, okay, we know from the economics of our client that based on the numbers we've got, we'd have to sell 50% of all of the breakfast cereal in Spain in order for this business case to make sense. Do we really think we're ever going to get to 50% of all breakfast cereal? Probably not. So in that case, even though you don't have precise numbers, you've got a pretty confident answer to the so what question that your project lead's going to ask you, that the partner's going to ask you, that the client's going to ask you in terms of whether or not it makes sense to go after this market. So armed with that amazing insight, you then write it up, document your assumptions so that you're not overstating your analysis, but nonetheless go confidently into your review meeting saying, this is what I've been able to find out, this is why I'm confident in it, here are the limitations of my analysis, and that gives you a way of addressing the problem of what happens when you get asked to do something that's literally impossible in your first few years at consulting. I hope that's been helpful, whether you're a consultant or perhaps in a related field. If so, please do like and subscribe to find out more things that I wish I'd known when I first started out in management consulting.